When Ashton Whitmore told me I wouldn't last a week without him, I didn't argue. I just reached into my Chanel bag, pulled out my keys, house, Range Rover, the ones he'd bragged about buying me, and set them neatly on the granite counter. The metallic clink echoed like a gunshot in our marble kitchen.
"You're right," I said quietly. "Let's find out."
His confident smirk faltered. Maybe he thought I'd cry or beg like I usually did when he delivered one of his power speeches about how I was nothing before him. But I didn't give him that satisfaction. I just walked out, closing the door on the life he thought he owned.
3 hours later, I sat in the Ritz-Carlton lobby, sipping coffee, watching our penthouse cameras from my phone. Ashton was pacing the kitchen, calling someone. Probably Nathan, maybe his father. Not the police. What would he even say? My wife left her keys and walked out? The concierge approached with a smile.
"Miss Hawthorne, your suite is ready." Miss Hawthorne. My maiden name. It sounded strange, like trying on an old dress that still fit perfectly. The room wasn't as large as our penthouse, but it was mine. Paid for with my own money. The 6 figures I'd quietly earned day trading while Ashton bragged to his friends that I played with stocks like other wives played tennis. He had no idea that his so-called allowance of $10,000 had multiplied into a private fortune. No one did. My phone buzzed with 17 missed calls. I deleted them all, but one voicemail slipped through. "Mila, this is ridiculous. Come home. We'll talk about whatever upset you." His voice was calm, almost amused. By the 5th message, he'd dropped the act. "You can't just leave. Half of everything's in both our names. You need my signature too." No, I didn't. That morning had begun like any other. I'd woken at 6 a.m. to an empty bed, coffee already brewed by the machine I'd learned to program myself, despite Ashton telling his friends I couldn't even use a toaster. It was our 4th wedding anniversary, though he hadn't mentioned it. He never did. I'd planned to organize his study, looking for insurance papers. Instead, I found his voice recorder. When it fell and switched on, his voice filled the room, mid-conversation. "She asked to see our investment statements yesterday," he was saying, laughing. "I told her they were too complicated. Lots of numbers." "Nathan, I could get her to sign over her kidneys and she'd just ask what pen to use." My hands shook. The recording was from last week, the day I'd brought him lunch at his office, proud of the sushi I'd picked. He'd introduced me as the beautiful Mrs. Whitmore. I remembered the smirk on his analyst's face then. I kept listening. "That's why this type is perfect," Ashton continued. "Pretty enough for photos, dumb enough to control, grateful enough to stay quiet. My father taught me, marry beauty, rent intelligence." That was the moment something inside me hardened. I placed the recorder back exactly as I found it and kept searching. In his drawer, I found a folder labeled Prenuptial Amendments, clauses about abandonment, forfeiture of assets, my signature forged. I stood there, surrounded by his empire, his awards, his certificates, his smug reminders of power, and realized he wasn't cruel by accident. He was strategic. He'd been planning my erasure for months. At the Ritz, I looked out the window toward our building. The lights in the penthouse still burned. He was probably tearing through drawers searching for what I'd taken. He'd find nothing missing, except his illusion of control. I hadn't stolen anything tangible yet. I'd only copied, photographed, prepared. That night, Richard Whitmore, his father, called. I let it ring. Richard was worse than Ashton. At their last gala, he'd introduced me as Ashton's wife. Pretty thing, isn't she? As if I were a luxury watch. Then a text from Margaret appeared, Richard's secretary of 40 years. "Heard you left. room 1247. When you're ready to talk, I have 40 years of information you need. For the first time in months, I smiled. Ashton thought I'd crumble without him. But he'd never asked what I was doing during all those quiet afternoons he left me alone. He never wondered why his father's secretary greeted me like an ally. He never imagined his trophy wife might be the one taking notes. 7 days. That's how long he said I wouldn't last. That's how long I gave myself to prove him wrong, because the keys I left behind weren't surrender. They were a declaration of war. And unlike Ashton, I'd read every term and condition before signing. 3 weeks later, I no longer lived like a woman escaping her marriage. I lived like someone building an empire of her own. Every morning, I traded from the Ritz suite, doubling my profits while the Whitmore markets quietly trembled. In the afternoons, I met with Margaret, who handed me documents in unmarked envelopes disguised as floral catalogs. Each file peeled back another layer of the Whitmore dynasty's corruption: shell companies, falsified audits, insider trades hidden beneath philanthropy. When she first arrived at my suite, she carried herself like a lifelong servant, shoulders slightly bowed, voice low, every movement precise. But her eyes, sharp, calculating, belonged to someone who had been waiting decades for this moment. Elena Whitmore started asking questions once, she said over tea. Richard's first wife. Died in a car crash the next week. Perfect weather, clear road. She sipped delicately. I've kept records ever since. I stared at her, realizing she'd spent her life surrounded by monsters, documenting their crimes in silence. Why me? I asked. Because you're the first one who didn't make excuses for him, she said simply. Her faith in me was both gift and burden. That night, I lay awake in my suite, the city glowing beneath my window. Richard and Ashton had spent their lives manipulating markets and people like equations, but they'd never considered what might happen if one of their variables learned how to calculate too. A week later, Ashton called from a blocked number. His voice was too smooth. We should talk. Just dinner, Mila. Be civilized about this. I agreed. It was May 15th, our actual anniversary. The salon smelled of expensive hairspray and eucalyptus oil. Special occasion? Celeste, my stylist, asked, as she shaped my hair into the sleek chignon Ashton preferred. Anniversary dinner, I said, forcing a smile. How wonderful! 4 years? Yes, 4 years. 4 years of being sculpted into his vision of perfection. I chose a navy dress, his favorite color, and slipped the flash drive Margaret had given me into my clutch. It held 4 decades of evidence, wrapped in a casing disguised as a lipstick tube. On my way out of the salon, a text appeared. Slight change. Nathan and Diana joining us. Need to discuss Singapore deal. My anniversary had become a business meeting. I typed back one word. Perfect. Minutes later, another message came. Actually, Father insists we come to the estate. He's having something catered. 8 p.m. Richard's estate wasn't a home. It was a monument. 12 acres of manicured arrogance where wealth felt like gravity. The circular drive was lined with Bentleys and Teslas. Patricia, his new wife, 28 and already exhausted, opened the door. Mila, you look stunning, she said softly, eyes flicking toward the sitting room. Why did you come? They seemed to say. Inside, Ashton stood with his usual tumbler of scotch, talking loudly. He didn't even pause when he saw me. Nathan smirked from across the room. Diana, pale and quiet, offered a fleeting, sympathetic glance. Richard appeared from his study, booming with forced cheer. There she is! Our lovely Mila. Though I hear you've been causing some turbulence. That won't do, my dear. Bad for business. Margaret passed through carrying champagne. Her gaze met mine, steady and deliberate. As she handed me a glass, she murmured, "Some anniversaries are about endings, not beginnings." Dinner was a tableau of performance. Crystal glasses, perfect plating, polite venom. I recognized everyone. Partners, investors, wives polished like accessories. Halfway through the meal, Ashton cleared his throat, clearly savoring the stage. "Funny story about how Mila and I met," he began, raising his glass. "She wandered into a derivatives panel thinking it was about art. Asked if hedge funds were about garden hedges." The table erupted in laughter. The story was a lie. I'd been at that conference, presenting my thesis on market manipulation. But truth didn't fit Ashton's narrative of rescuing a naive beauty. "Thank God for lost puppies," Nathan added, smirking. "They make the best pets." The laughter rippled again. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides a blade. Then I excused myself. Richard's study door was ajar. Inside, his computer glowed, abandoned mid-task. A post-it note stuck to the monitor read, Richard 3, 1936, his password, his birth year, and Shakespearean alter ego. Predictable. I slid into the chair, fingers flying. The safe behind the painting of water lilies, the cabinet labeled private, the emails linking Richard to executives Ashton later traded against, all photographed in seconds. From the window, I could see the table below. Ashton laughing, gesturing with his wineglass. The portrait of success. If only they knew their empire was already bleeding. When I returned, the conversation had shifted to business. Singapore expansion, leverage ratios, compliance concerns. I sat quietly, the obedient ornament. Then Nathan, drunk enough to forget his mask, leaned toward me. "You know what Ashton is?" he said to the room. "An empire builder. And Mila here, she's the trophy case. Beautiful, elegant, but ultimately just for display." The laughter came again. Ashton raised his glass. "Best investment I ever made," he said. "Minimal maintenance, excellent returns." Margaret was clearing plates when our eyes met. Her expression was no longer cautious. It was resolved. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. That was all I needed. The diamond on my finger sparkled under the chandelier as I stood, each facet reflecting a piece of the woman I used to be. Without a word, I walked out, my heels echoing against the marble, leaving behind a room full of men who had just witnessed the moment their dynasty began to crack. Because from that night forward, I wasn't running. I was coming for them. The night I left Richard's estate, I didn't cry. I didn't even shake. I simply drove through the dark in silence, the city lights flickering like coded messages across my windshield. At a red light, I pulled a burner phone from my glove compartment and typed one line to the only contact saved inside. Tuesday, 2 p.m., Jade Garden, Chinatown. Margaret's reply came minutes later. "I'll bring tea." 3 days of waiting felt like a lifetime. I kept my routine at the Ritz, morning trades, afternoon walks through Central Park, late-night reviews of every document Margaret had slipped me. By now, I had mapped out half the Whitmore Empire's dirty money web. But what she handed me at Jade Garden would detonate everything. The restaurant was a narrow, steaming labyrinth of dim sum baskets and old neon. Margaret sat at a corner table, her cardigan buttoned to the throat despite the heat. She looked like anyone's grandmother. Soft voice, silver hair pinned neatly. But her eyes were steel. "I started collecting in 1982, she said, sliding a tin of butter cookies across the table. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a lipstick tube. Twist the bottom 3 times. I did. The cap popped off to reveal a hidden flash drive. 16 gigabytes. 40 years of secrets. Elena Whitmore asked me to watch the books, Margaret continued. Then she had her accident. After that, I kept everything. Every memo, every fake audit, every mistress funded with company money. Richard thinks I'm a harmless old woman. Her mouth tightened. That's my greatest advantage. We drank tea as she detailed the empire's history. Wives erased, partners paid off, rivals crushed. When she mentioned Caroline, the second wife, her voice dropped to a whisper. She was brilliant. MBA from Wharton. Asked too many questions. They had her committed for exhaustion. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she poured more tea. She signed the divorce papers from a psychiatric facility. I felt sick. How did you survive all this? I didn't, she said simply. I just endured long enough to meet someone who could finish what I started. That night, I sat cross-legged on my hotel bed, scrolling through files. The sheer weight of them was staggering. Fraud, tax evasion, bribery, it was all there. But one file stopped me cold. Diana Chin, private correspondence, emails, hotel invoices, photos. Ashton and Nathan's wives' names entangled in deception. My husband wasn't just corrupt. He was cruel in ways I hadn't yet measured. He and Nathan had traded women the same way they traded stocks. And according to the timestamps, Ashton was preparing to replace me with Diana. The realization burned away the last of my fear. At 11:30 p.m., I called Patricia Kim, the lawyer Margaret had recommended, someone completely outside New York's glittering network of corporate loyalty. She answered on the second ring. I need a company, I said. Something invisible. Something that sounds like nothing. When? Tomorrow. By noon the next day, I was in her Connecticut office signing papers for Phantom Rose Holdings, LLC. The name made her smile faintly. Pretty, she said, but complicated enough to be untraceable. Perfect. Over the next week, Ashton left for Singapore, allegedly for expansion talks. In truth, Margaret's intel confirmed he was opening accounts in his own name, shielding assets before the inevitable fallout. That was fine. I had other plans. Once he was gone, I returned to the penthouse. Maria, the housekeeper, blinked when I told her to take the week off with pay. Are you sure, Mrs. Whitmore? Yes. I need to do this myself. As soon as the door closed, I went to work. His office was immaculate, arranged with the precision of a man who trusted only himself. Unfortunately for Ashton, I knew him better than he knew me. His password, our wedding date, unlocked his computer. What I found was both predictable and horrifying. Trade logs timestamped within hours of Richard's business lunches. Offshore transfers linked to shell companies. Emails full of contempt. He and his father had manipulated markets for decades, gambling with insider knowledge while calling it intuition. In a locked drawer, I found something worse. Emails between Ashton and Nathan discussing my mental fragility. Plans to have me evaluated by a psychiatrist friendly to Richard's firm. They'd done it before, to Caroline. I photographed every file, uploaded everything to Phantom Rose's encrypted cloud, then replaced every item precisely as I'd found it. By the time Ashton returned, he'd never know I'd been there. But in his safe, hidden behind the Warren Buffett biography, lay the final piece. A folder titled Exit Strategy. Inside was a timeline for my removal. Divorce, character assassination, institutionalization, asset forfeiture. A neat little roadmap to my destruction, complete with profit projections. I took photos of every page, then sat in his leather chair, staring at the city below. He'd built a throne from arrogance and underestimation, and I, the ornament he thought disposable, was now holding the hammer. The next morning, I swam laps at the Equinox on Park Avenue, trying to wash the taste of fury from my mouth. When I climbed out, Diana was waiting. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the dark bruise under her jawline. "Nathan knows," she whispered, "about the messages." The investigator he hired cloned my phone. I stared at her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because whatever you're planning, be careful. They don't just destroy reputations, they destroy lives." She adjusted her sunglasses, voice trembling. "They know something's coming." Then she was gone, heels clicking across the marble. That evening, Ashton came home early. He brought flowers, calla lilies, my least favorite. "Dinner?" he asked casually, pouring wine like nothing had changed. We hadn't eaten together in months. He was performing, and I knew it. He pushed a document across the table. "New insurance policy," he said lightly. "Better coverage for both of us. Just sign here." Under the table, my phone's camera captured every page. "You trust me, don't you?" he asked. "Completely," I lied. By the next week, his father was calling lawyers. Nathan was shifting money offshore. Diana had vanished. And the war had officially begun. The week that followed blurred into theater. A perfectly staged illusion where Ashton played the role of devoted husband, and I, his willing prop. He picked my mother up from JFK himself, something he'd never done in all our years of marriage, and performed affection so flawlessly that even she, a woman who'd taught me to trust my instincts, began to believe him. "Oh, honey," she whispered to me that first night, glancing toward Ashton as he stirred her gin and tonic with the exact ratio she liked. "You didn't tell me things had gotten better." "He seems so devoted." I smiled, keeping my voice even. "He's full of surprises." It was a performance within a performance. Every smile calculated, every movement rehearsed. Ashton booked Broadway shows, arranged spa days, and toasted my mother at dinner as the woman who raised such an incredible daughter. To anyone watching, we looked like the picture of reconciliation. To me, it felt like the tightening of a noose. At night, I'd hear him whispering into his phone in his study, half sentences and names I recognized from Margaret's files. He was desperate now, moving pieces on a board that was already on fire. When my mother finally left, I hugged her tight, feeling the weight of everything I couldn't say. She studied my face, brushing my cheek like she used to when I was a child. "You've lost weight," she murmured. "Are you happy?" "I'm exactly where I planned to be," I said. Ashton stood in the hallway, pretending not to listen. After she left, Margaret texted, "Meet me, library, tomorrow." The New York Public Library's Rose Reading Room gleamed with marble and quiet power, a temple for words in a city that preferred noise. Margaret sat at a corner table, newspaper clippings spread out before her like tarot cards. "Elena Whitmore," she said, tapping a photo. "Car crash, 1994. Another clipping. Caroline, institutionalized, 2003. Then a third. Jennifer, bankruptcy and disappearance, 2015. Finally, she added a fourth photo. Mine. "All blonde," she murmured. "All between 5'4" and 5'6". All from middle-class families. All married to Whitmore men." My stomach turned. "You think Richard chooses them?" She nodded slowly. "He calls it branding, says consistency builds trust among investors. She lowered her voice. He picks them, Ashton marries them, and when they stop smiling on command, they vanish. Year 4. Always year 4. I was 4 years and 3 months into my marriage. My voice came out hoarse. Why did you stay, Margaret? Why not run? She smoothed the papers with trembling hands. Because I knew no one would believe me alone. I needed someone like you. Someone he'd underestimate. Before we left, she slid another photo toward me. A young woman in graduation robes. Madison Hayes. Richard's newest project. 22. Her father owns a small investment firm. They had lunch last week. I tucked the picture into my wallet behind my old student ID. A reminder of who I'd been before the Whitmores tried to rewrite me. The next morning, I began moving the money. $8,000 first. Small enough not to trigger suspicion. Then 12. Then 15. Each withdrawal disguised as furniture shopping or spa treatments. Every cent reappeared in Phantom Rose Holdings, transformed into consulting income. Patricia's advice echoed in my mind. The IRS loves fiction, as long as it's well documented. That night, Ashton stumbled through the front door, smelling of expensive scotch. Lost the Morrison account, he muttered, slamming his tumbler down. $40 million in assets, gone. Compliance concerns, can you believe that? I could. Margaret had leaked enough to start the unraveling. The next day, more withdrawals. The day after, another. By week's end, Ashton's empire was bleeding cash faster than he could conceal it. His calls grew shorter, his temper sharper. Nathan and Richard's names appeared in the headlines with the faintest scent of scandal. Not enough to destroy, just enough to crack the glass. Then Patricia called from an unlisted number. The FBI reached out, she said quietly. They've been investigating Richard for 18 months. They want to talk to you. Do they know about me? They know enough. A whistleblower complaint triggered everything. They need corroboration. Internal records, first-hand knowledge. It's time, Mila. That night, Ashton was already drunk before dinner. His glass clinked endlessly as he muttered to himself, eyes red and distant. They're saying someone's talking to the feds. You'd tell me if you knew anything, right? Of course, I said smoothly, refilling his drink. I'm your wife. The next morning, I put on a cream dress and pearls, smiled at myself in the mirror, and drove to a rest stop off I-95. Patricia was waiting in her Honda, her briefcase resting on the passenger seat. She handed me a small card. Agent Sarah Coleman, she's expecting your call. Will this protect me? I asked. She met my eyes. Whistleblower laws can't protect your heart, Mila. But they'll protect your freedom. That evening, I dialed the number. Securities and Exchange Commission Enforcement Division, a woman's voice answered. My name is Mila Hawthorne, I said. I have evidence of systematic insider trading at Whitmore Capital Management. Decades worth. The agent's tone sharpened. You're ready to make a statement. I looked out at the city skyline. The towers built on greed and secrets. Yes, I said. Because I finally understand that silence makes me complicit. By the end of the call, I wasn't Mrs. Whitmore anymore. I was Exhibit A. 2 days later, the headlines broke. Nathan had filed for divorce from Diana, citing irreconcilable differences and instability. Ashton called 17 times in an hour, his voice unraveling with every message. What did you tell her? He screamed. Nothing, I replied. But it seems she found her own truth. By evening, Margaret texted. Richard called emergency meeting, empire cracking. And as I stared at those words, glowing on my screen, I finally smiled. because I knew the sound of something breaking wasn't always tragic. Sometimes it was the beginning of freedom. By the time Richard called that emergency meeting, I already knew the empire was beyond repair. Nathan had withdrawn his shares, Diana had vanished into a lawyer's protection, and the Morrison account had set off a chain reaction among investors. Everything Ashton had built on arrogance and deception was collapsing. Slowly, beautifully, inevitably, but I wasn't finished. Not yet. That night, I put on a red wig and a pair of cheap sunglasses, the kind you buy at drugstores. My navy suit came from Target, not Prada. When I looked in the mirror, the reflection staring back was unrecognizable. Exactly as planned. Nathan's office on Madison Avenue had the kind of security that looked expensive, but functioned mostly as decoration. I'd been there dozens of times as Ashton's wife. I knew every blind spot. I waited until the guard changed shifts and Nathan's assistant went out for sushi, then slipped into the elevator. The ride to the 42nd floor felt endless. In my purse, I carried a manila envelope thick with printed screenshots. Ashton's messages mocking Nathan, scheming to steal his clients. His detailed plans to seduce Diana once her divorce was finalized. The final page held a projected profit sheet labeled Post-Divorce Acquisition Strategy. Ashton had quantified betrayal down to the decimal point. Nathan's office door was locked, but the mail slot worked perfectly. I slipped the envelope through and walked back to the elevator with the quiet confidence of someone who'd just detonated a bomb. 3 hours later, Margaret sent a text. Partnership dissolved. Legal team in crisis. Nathan declared full separation. The dominoes were falling faster now. I checked into the Warwick Hotel under my maiden name, Mila Hawthorne, and called the SEC hotline again to confirm the first transfer of evidence. Your documents are authentic, Agent Coleman told me. What you've given us will open cases that have been dormant for decades. I ended the call, exhaled, and ordered room service. For the first time in years, food had taste. At 7 a.m. sharp, Ashton's voice exploded on my phone. 17 missed calls, then 28, then 47. Each voicemail was a different version of the same man unraveling. Mila, the bank just called. Something's wrong with our accounts. This isn't funny. Call me back. You're destroying everything we built. Then finally, at 11 a.m., his voice broke completely. Please, they're freezing everything. The FBI is here. God, please answer. I didn't. Instead, I called Patricia. He's losing control, I said. She laughed softly. Everything you've done is legal, Mila. The assets were joint. Half of everything belongs to you. He can't undo that. Not without admitting fraud. By noon, the television in my hotel room switched to live coverage. Breaking news. Whitmore Capital under federal investigation. Cameras flashed outside Richard's Westchester estate as FBI agents carried boxes of evidence down marble steps. Richard himself appeared in handcuffs, face gray, eyes hollow. The reporters swarmed like vultures. Margaret texted me a single champagne bottle emoji. I laughed, because for a woman who'd lived her life in silence, that emoji was the loudest victory cry imaginable. Over the next 3 weeks, the Whitmore empire imploded. Nathan fled to Switzerland. 2 partners turned state's evidence. Ashton's lawyer sent letters full of hollow threats that Patricia shredded without reading. The world that once mocked me as ornamental was now begging for mercy in televised hearings. Then, one Thursday evening, Ashton found me. I was sitting at the Ritz-Carlton bar, drinking champagne I'd bought with my own money. He looked ruined, unshaven, pale. His Tom Ford suit wrinkled like he'd slept in it. You destroyed everything, he said, voice slurred with whiskey. I turned on my barstool, meeting his bloodshot eyes. No, I said quietly. I revealed everything. We had a life, he argued. You had a life. I had a role.
He laughed bitterly. You think you've won? My father!
Your father's facing 20 years, I interrupted. And you'll be lucky if you get less. He reached for my wrist. I moved before he could touch me. The bartender, a woman about Margaret's age, stepped forward. Sir, you need to leave.
Do you know who I am? Ashton demanded, voice cracking.
Yes, she said coolly. And I don't care.
Security escorted him out.
The bartender set another glass of champagne in front of me, on the house. That was long overdue, she said. I raised the glass slightly. To overdo things, I murmured, and drank. 2 days later, the subpoena arrived. The FBI wanted my full cooperation. Margaret and I were both to testify. When I walked into that courtroom weeks later, Richard looked smaller than I remembered, swallowed by the gray of his prison-issued suit. Ashton sat beside him, pale and silent. A man finally stripped of his illusions. Margaret took the stand first. Her voice was calm, deliberate. She laid out 40 years of corruption, each sentence a nail in their collective coffin. Why did you keep these records? The prosecutor asked. Margaret adjusted her glasses. Because I knew someday someone would be brave enough to use them, she said, looking straight at me. Someone like Miss Hawthorne. The prosecutor blinked. You mean Mrs. Whitmore? Margaret smiled faintly. No, I mean Miss Hawthorne. She took back her name, and everything that came with it. That night, Patricia called. It's done, she said simply. Convictions are guaranteed. Richard will die behind bars. Ashton's facing 15 to 20. I stood by the window, Manhattan glittering below. The towers looked different now. Smaller, maybe. Or maybe I was finally seeing them for what they were. Monuments to fragile men who believed they were untouchable. The divorce came through 3 weeks later. Patricia slid the decree across her desk with a satisfied smile. The house, 60% of remaining assets, and your separate holdings are all yours. The court ruled in your favor completely. She played one last recording for the judge. Ashton's voice, smug and certain. She wouldn't understand a financial statement if I drew her pictures. That's the beauty of marrying someone decorative. Judge Catherine Chin leaned forward. Mr. Whitmore, she said, it seems you were wrong about your wife's intelligence. Perhaps if you'd respected it, you wouldn't be here today. When I signed the final line, Mila Hawthorne, it felt like breathing for the first time in years. Outside, Margaret waited in a new navy suit, holding a file embossed with a phoenix rising from ashes. Our first client just called, she said, a senator's wife. She's been documenting campaign violations for 2 years, wants help escaping before they bury her. I looked at the logo. Phoenix Foundation, I read aloud. She smiled. Seemed fitting. That afternoon, we unlocked the doors of our new office. 4 small rooms on the same floor where Whitmore Capital once operated. Sunlight streamed through the windows, warm and forgiving. Our first client arrived an hour later, trembling, clutching a folder like a lifeline. Margaret smiled kindly. Every document tells a story, she said. We'll help you write a better ending. Spring arrived quietly that year. The kind of soft New York spring where even the traffic seems to exhale. 6 months had passed since the trial, and though headlines still whispered about the fall of the Whitmore dynasty, I had stopped reading them. The empire was gone, the men imprisoned or disgraced, and for the first time in years, I no longer woke to the sound of someone else's ambition. I'd moved to Brooklyn, into a sunlit apartment that smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paint. It wasn't grand like the penthouse, but it was mine. Every chair, every cup, every lock paid for with clean money. My mornings began with quiet, a walk to the corner cafe, then hours at the Phoenix Foundation, where women came carrying folders and fears that looked too much like the ones I used to hide. Margaret and I worked side by side, her sharpness softened now by purpose. "You're faster than I ever was," she told me once, half proud, half weary. "You didn't waste 40 years waiting for permission." The first month, 4 women reached out for help. By spring, there were 17. Some brought spreadsheets, others bruises. All of them stories that began the same way. A man who convinced them their silence was love. The Phoenix Foundation became our quiet rebellion, built above the ruins of the fund that once financed women's ruin. Each time a client walked out free, with her assets, her dignity, or just her will to start again, I felt something mend inside me. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, my mother called. "I'm coming to visit," she announced, in the tone that meant no arguments. "I want to see where my daughter lives now." At JFK, I met her myself, driving my own battered Honda, the kind that blends into traffic instead of commanding it. When she saw me, she blinked, smiling through tears. "You look different," she said softly. "You look real." That week, we cooked together in my tiny kitchen, burning one turkey and laughing about it. She didn't ask about Ashton or the money. She didn't have to. She could see the answer in the way I moved around my own space without hesitation. "You're happy," she said one night over tea. "I'm free," I told her. Maybe that's the same thing. After she left, the quiet didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt earned. Then one morning, my phone buzzed, Margaret's number flashing on the screen. Her voice was brisk, but I could hear the spark behind it. "New client," she said. "Senator Williams's wife. Campaign finance violations, fraud, threats, the usual. She's scared but ready. Can you come?" On my way. Before leaving, I paused by the window. Across the street, a young couple walked hand in hand. The girl, Madison Hayes, I realized, wore the same wide smile I'd seen in her photo months ago. She wasn't marrying a Whitmore. She was free of their orbit. That, more than any conviction or settlement, felt like justice. The drive to the office took me past the glass towers of Midtown, gleaming like ghosts of a life I no longer envied. The elevator opened to the 3rd floor, where the sign for the Phoenix Foundation caught the morning light. Inside, Margaret sat at her desk, reviewing a stack of files. Her gray hair was pinned back, her posture regal. For a woman who'd spent decades serving men, she now looked like someone born to lead. Our new client sat across from her, trembling slightly. "My husband says I'm paranoid," she whispered. "Says I wouldn't understand the numbers anyway." Margaret smiled, kind but firm. "Every document tells a story. We'll help you write a new ending." The woman looked at me, uncertain. "You really think I can start over?" I thought about the night I'd stood in my marble kitchen, setting down my keys, not realizing it was the most powerful thing I'd ever done. "Yes," I said. "You just have to decide you're worth starting for." After she left, Margaret leaned back in her chair. "You realize what we're doing, don't you?" she said. "We're building something from ashes." I smiled. That was always the plan. Later that afternoon, I drove to what used to be the Whitmore penthouse. It was being sold, emptied of its art, its furniture, its ghosts. The realtor met me at the door, paperwork in hand. "Are you sure you don't want to keep it?" she asked. "The view alone is priceless." "I've already had that view," I said. It didn't show me anything worth seeing. I signed the last document and handed her the keys, the same ones I'd left on that counter the day I walked out. They no longer felt heavy. The proceeds from the sale would keep the foundation running for another 2 years. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ashton's marble cage would now fund the freedom of women he'd have called ungrateful. As I turned to leave, I took one last look at the skyline beyond the glass walls. It glittered like it always had. Indifferent, beautiful, cold. But somewhere beneath it, new stories were being written. Quieter ones, that didn't need to shout to be powerful. Outside, the air was crisp with late winter. I slid into my car, my phone buzzing with a new message from Diana. "Coffee tomorrow? I have someone you should meet. She needs our help." I smiled, starting the engine. "Always," I whispered to no one in particular. The city lights blurred past as I drove home, back to Brooklyn, back to simplicity, back to myself. I thought of Margaret, of the women we'd saved, of the ones still waiting to find the courage to walk away. Freedom, I'd learned, doesn't arrive like a rescue. It's built. One decision, one document, one brave moment at a time. And sometimes it begins with something as small as the sound of keys hitting a counter. If you found yourself cheering for Mila's quiet revenge and her journey toward freedom, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves powerful stories, and subscribe for more tales that remind us strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks away. Tell me in the comments, what was your favorite moment?